Today I'm reading from Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self by C.G. Jung. I'm reading from Chapter 4, The Self, paragraph 49. If, on the other hand, the inner authority is conceived as the will of God, which implies that natural forces are divine forces, our self-esteem is benefited because the decision then appears to be an act of obedience, and the result a divine intention. This way of looking at it can, with some show of justice, be accused not only of being very convenient, but of cloaking moral laxity in the mantle of virtue. The accusation, however, is justified only when one is in fact knowingly hiding one's own egoistic opinion behind a hypocritical façade of words. But this is by no means the rule, for in most cases instinctive tendencies assert themselves for or against one's subjective interests, no matter whether an outside authority approves or not. The inner authority does not need to be consulted first, as it is present at the outset in the intensity of the tendencies struggling for decision. In this struggle, the individual is never a spectator only. He takes part in it more or less voluntarily and tries to throw the weight of his feeling of moral freedom into the scales of decision. Nevertheless, it remains a matter of doubt how much his seemingly free decision has a causal and possibly unconscious motivation. This may be quite as much an act of God as any natural cataclysm. The problem seems to me unanswerable because we do not know where the roots of the feeling of moral freedom lie, and yet they exist no less surely than the instincts, which are felt as compelling forces. Paragraph 50. All in all, it is not only more beneficial but more correct psychologically to explain as the will of God the natural forces that appear in us as instincts. In this way, we find ourselves living in harmony with the habitus of our ancestral psychic life. That is, we function as man has functioned at all times and in all places. The existence of this habitus is proof of its viability, for, if it were not viable, all those who obeyed it would have long since perished of maladaptation. On the other hand, by conforming to it, one has a reasonable life expectancy. When a habitual way of thinking guarantees as much as this, there is not only no ground for declaring it incorrect, but, on the contrary, every reason to take it as true or correct in the psychological sense. Psychological truths are not metaphysical insights. They are habitual modes of thinking, feeling, and behaving which experience has proved appropriate and useful. Paragraph 51. So when I say that the impulses which we find in ourselves should be understood as the will of God, I wish to emphasize that they ought not to be regarded as an arbitrary wishing and willing, but as absolutes which one must learn how to handle correctly. The will can control them only in part. It may be able to suppress them, but it cannot alter their nature. And what is suppressed comes up again in another place in altered form, but this time loaded with a resentment that makes the otherwise harmless natural impulse our enemy. But this time loaded with a resentment that makes the otherwise harmless natural impulse our enemy. I should also like the term God in the phrase the will of God to be understood not so much in the Christian sense as in the sense intended by Diotima when she said, quote, Eros, dear Socrates, is a mighty demon, unquote. The Greek words daemon and daemonion express a determining power which comes upon man from outside, like providence or fate, though the ethical decision is left to man. He must know, however, what he is deciding about and what he is doing. Then, if he obeys, he is following not just his own opinion, and if he rejects, he is destroying not just his own invention. Paragraph 52. The purely biological or scientific standpoint falls short in psychology because it is, in the main, intellectual only. That this should be so is not a disadvantage, since the methods of natural science have proved of great heuristic value in psychological research. But the psychic phenomenon cannot be grasped in its totality by the intellect, for it consists not only of meaning, but also of value. And this depends on the intensity accompanying feeling tones. Hence, at least the two rational functions are needed in order to map out anything like a complete diagram of a given psychic content. Paragraph 53. If, therefore, in dealing with psychic contents, one makes allowance not only for intellectual judgments, but for value judgments as well, not only is the result a more complete picture of the content in question, but one also gets a better idea of the particular position it holds in the hierarchy of psychic contents in general. The feeling value is a very important criterion which psychology cannot do without, because it determines in large measure the role which the content will play in the psychic economy. That is to say, the effective value gives the measure of the intensity of an idea, and the intensity in its turn expresses that idea's energetic tension, its effective potential. The shadow, for instance, usually has a decidedly negative feeling value, while the anima, like the animus, has more of a positive one. While the shadow is accompanied by more or less definite and describable feeling tones, the anima and animus exhibit feeling qualities that are harder to define. Mostly they are felt to be fascinating or numinous. Often they are surrounded by an atmosphere of sensitivity, touchy reserve, secretiveness, painful intimacy, and even absoluteness. The relative autonomy of the anima and animus figures expresses itself in these qualities. In order of effective rank, they stand to the shadow very much as the shadow stands in relation to ego consciousness. The main effective emphasis seems to lie on the latter. At any rate, it is able, by means of a considerable expenditure of energy, to repress the shadow, at least temporarily. But for any reason the unconscious gains the upper hand, then the valency of the shadow and of the figures increases proportionately, so that the scale of values is reversed. What lay further away from the waking consciousness and seemed unconscious assumes, as it were, a threatening shape, and the effective value increases the higher up the scale you go. Ego consciousness, shadow, anima, self. This reversal of the conscious waking state occurs regularly during the transition from waking to sleeping, and what then emerge most vividly are the very things that were unconscious by day. Every abaissement de niveau mental brings about a relative reversal of values. Paragraph 54. I am speaking here of the subjective feeling value, which is subject to the more or less periodic changes described above. But there are also objective values, which are founded on a consensus omnium, moral, aesthetic, and religious values. For instance, and these are universally recognized ideals or feeling-tone collective ideas, Lévi-Bruhl's représentation collective, the subjective feeling tones or value quanta are easily recognized by the kind and number of constellations or symptoms of disturbance they produce. Collective ideas often have no subjective feeling tone, but nevertheless retain their feeling value. This value, therefore, cannot be demonstrated by subjective symptoms, though it may be by the attributes attaching to these collective ideas and by their characteristic symbolism, quite apart from their subjective effect. Paragraph 55. The problem has a practical aspect, since it may easily happen that a collective idea, though significant in itself, is, because of its lack of subjective feeling tone, represented by a dream only by a subsidiary attribute, as when a god is represented by his theriomorphic attribute, etc. Conversely, the idea may appear in consciousness lacking the effective emphasis that properly belongs to it, and must then be transposed back into its archetypal context, a task that is usually discharged by poets and prophets. Thus Holderlin, in his Hymn to Liberty, lets this concept, worn stale by frequent use and misuse, rise up again in its pristine splendor. Quoting Holderlin's poem, "Since her arm out of the dust has raised me, beats my heart so boldly and serene, and my cheek still tingles with her kisses, flushed and glowing where her lips have been. Every word she utters by her magic rises new created without flaw. Hearken to the tidings of my goddess, hearken to the sovereign and adored." Paragraph 56. It is not difficult to see here that the idea of liberty has been changed back to its original dramatic state, into the shining figure of the Anima, freed from the weight of the earth and the tyranny of the senses, the psychopomp who leads the way to the Elysian fields.